Welcome back to day 2 of the conference. Thanks very much for bearing with us. Sorry, I'm starting a little bit behind schedule. Especially welcome to those of you who joined today. There'll be plenty of opportunity during sessions to catch up on what we covered yesterday. A little bit of a reminder, we had 3 or 4 really good sessions yesterday. Some framing at the high level issues, the process, the agendas, a sense of the ambition in the FFD process, some detailed technical discussions, some of the emerging research, and then I think a particularly good set of perspectives from country level officials and those on the ground who really look at this from the demand side and accessing some of the sort of the sources of finance, looking at the purposes, how those are used, and navigating this sort of new world of complex external finance. Today, we want to try and do 2 things. We want to move from the sort of discursive to the propositional. We had a lot of material on the table yesterday, a lot of issues aired. We have the privilege of many people in the room today who have responsibility of helping to craft this outcome document or help prepare it or make all sorts of contributions. And I'm reliably informed that they do really want to hear from us. There's still opportunity for good ideas, good thinking, good propositions to go in. So a bit more propositional, a bit more specific, thinking ahead and anticipating what language might look like, what most important points are, would be really welcome. The second thing I think is focus. Despite my best efforts of the panel to keep us on international public finance, we had quite a broad array of flows yesterday. We're really going to try and narrow it down on the role of official finance, international public finance. So if people could sort of bear that in mind, and then we're almost focusing on that particular section of the outcome document. 2 things to draw your attention to. The first is you'll see around the room some cartoons. You may be wondering what those are about. We invited ahead of the conference a number of cartoonists from around the world to depict what they thought of when sort of talking about or thinking about the financing development process. And these are some of the visual representations of that. And second, if you're wondering what's been emerging on the back wall over the course of the last day, there's a sort of a visual representation of some of the discussions, some of the debates, some of the issues by our sort of, for the purpose of these 2 days, our artist in residence, Amadou, who's just sitting back, so he'll be able to guide you through. But please do take a look. It gives, I think, a rather interesting, rather different perspective of capturing some of the discussions. That will be digitised, turned into a bit more of a, something online, and we'll have some more material coming from that. So on to today, there will going to be, shortly we will hear some opening remarks from today from one of the co-chairs of the FFD process, Viennese Ambassador Talbot. Then we'll move into a session looking at presenting some more of the current research from some of the leading thinkers and experts, before turning the tables a little bit and giving you the opportunity to quiz some of those experts, the sort of speed geeking. If you're wondering what that's all about, Gideon will introduce that in about an hour or so. But people will be making their pitch to you for what they think the most important propositions are. And then we will draw this together towards the end of the day with a high-level panel that will try to sketch out some propositions. One piece of housekeeping, again, we put on a lunchtime session as yesterday. I think it was a really successful lunchtime session yesterday. Now, just a show of hands, if you'd be interested in taking lunch while hearing from a couple of experts and a bit of content, just to raise your hands again. Yeah, I think for the organisers, I think that's a yes, so a good showing. Thank you for that. Let me, without further ado, introduce the ambassador and ask him if he would offer some opening remarks for the day, and then I'll hand us over to the panel. Ambassador Talbot, the floor is yours. You're extremely welcome.
Good morning, thank you very much. I want to thank the ODI Asset and the Government of Ghana for the opportunity to be in Accra for the first time and to engage in this very rich discussion on financing for development. This is a common enterprise in which we are all engaged. I have the privilege, along with the Ambassador of Norway to the UN, Ambassador Geir Pedersen, to help to facilitate the preparations for the Addis conference. But we very much recognize this as a collective effort, and we value all inputs from all sources, recognizing that no one has a monopoly on ideas. And I want to pick up on the point just made that the floor and the door are still open for ideas. We have just, after working very hard with partners, delegations, institutional stakeholders, representatives of civil society, private sector, etc., we have put together what we call a zero draft of the outcome document for Addis. And I want to emphasize that is the start, that's the beginning, not the end. And we hope that it will serve as a basis on which to build, so that we will move onward and upward. I know, of course, that there will be very intense negotiations ahead of us, and we look forward to facilitating those negotiations in a constructive spirit and coming to an outcome that will be worthy of the occasion. Now, I want to just make a few remarks on foundation and then on future. First, on foundation, the Addis conference is the third international conference on financing for development, and it is building on the foundation of its predecessors. First, Monterrey, and secondly, Doha. And what precisely is that foundation? I would just share three aspects from my perspective on the foundations that were laid in Monterrey. One is the recognition of the need for attention to national, international, and systemic issues in addressing financing for development. I think these were the three key axes going into Monterrey, which of course were framed in a broader package in the outcome document itself. So, secondly, that it was not just about external support, it was also about national policies. And that is encapsulated in the words, I think, in the early chapters of Monterrey, which that the national policies, the role of national policies cannot be overemphasized. Of course, the corollary to that is that national policies are necessary. Good national policies are necessary, but not sufficient for the achievement of our goals, even at the national level. And the results of the 2008 financial crisis is a case in point, where many small economies in particular, and some not so small, were affected by developments in other jurisdictions, notwithstanding the many efforts to strengthen national frameworks and policy environments. I think the third dimension of the Monterrey Foundation is that financing for development required a comprehensive and holistic approach. And in that regard, it was more than ODA. We needed to draw together the various sources and link them in a comprehensive framework. And we've been hearing a bit about linking sources with uses, somewhat more in our discussions so far in the session. Fourth and final point I will make on this is the recognition of the Monterrey, extended in Doha, are, I think, key dimensions of the process going forward. Monterrey, of course, came in the wake of the MDG agenda, which was largely a North-South agenda, the North helping the South to achieve Millennium Development Goals and the agreements reached in major international conferences and summits convened by the UN. Doha came in the wake of the outbreak of the 2008 financial and economic crisis. But Addis is coming on the eve of a number of important processes. One being, of course, the MDG deadline itself. A second being the launch of the post-2015 development agenda, which is a much expanded global agenda. And three, the Paris Conference on Financing Climate Change. These events, of course, are very closely interrelated. We cannot conceive, at least not from where I sit, of sustainable development without adequate attention, ambitious action, strong outcomes on addressing climate change. But of course, we need action on a broad front. So, coming now to the future, I think the context to which I alluded, namely the launch of the post-2015 development agenda and the important gathering in Paris on climate change, are, I think, the key contextual scenario for the third international conference on financing for development. And of course, the financing for development has its own origins, as I've pointed out, but there we see that there is a convergence between the stream emerging from Monterrey and the stream emerging from the Rio process, Rio +20 most recently, and focus on sustainable development. And hence, we see that the emphasis of the third conference will be on the financing of sustainable development, and what will that entail? So the dimension of sustainability, as has been emphasized, is a key dimension in framing the purpose of Addis. And we recognize sustainability and sustainable development as entailing an integrated approach to policy, integrating the economic, social, and environmental dimensions. And within that framework, we have an agreement, an emerging agreement on the post-2015 development agenda, at the core of which will be sustainable development goals. There is currently a package of 17 proposed goals. The expectation is that there will not be much redoing or undoing of that package. I think it is, here I might be venturing a bit, but I think it's reasonably safe to expect that that package will remain largely intact. I think the risks of trying to redo it at this very late stage perhaps might not be worth the effort. So this is the process, the product of a process in which all states have been involved, very intensely so. And I think it speaks to the varying dimensions of the agenda, the economic, social, and environmental. It speaks, of course, also to the varying concerns and priorities that member states have, and together it forms a package which will be at the core of the post-2015 development agenda. So that is a key challenge of the Addis conference. How do we speak to the post-2015 development agenda? How do we help to mobilize the resources that will help to deliver that agenda, which, as I think a speaker yesterday was cautioning on the need to manage expectations. It is, of course, a very ambitious agenda, and we see the need for a correspondingly ambitious agenda on the financing side, on the mobilization of the means of implementation. And that consideration is one of the key reasons why the Addis conference is coming before the post-2015 summit. Some might ask the reason, why is this? Why not agree on the agenda and then look at how you finance it? But I think there was a measure of concern in a large segment of the UN community and international community, mainly developing countries, that of the need for an assurance that we were really serious. We are really serious about implementing the very ambitious agenda that we will agree in September. And so Addis is seen as an important litmus test of the international community's commitment to implement the very ambitious agenda that it will adopt a few weeks after Addis. Now, this concern is has to be reconciled with another notion that the Addis conference is not a pledging conference per se, and meaning that we're not expecting that there will be pledges on amounts for goal A or B or C, etc. But at the same time, there is need for a clear signal of strong commitment to implementation. Now, how do we bring these elements together? I think that is part of the challenge of the process going forward. And we hope that the outcome document, the draft that we've put forward, will help us to move forward on that front. Now, why is it that we're not thinking of individual funds for every goal? I think it's partly in what my colleague from the Secretariat, Shari, said yesterday, that we're looking at the agenda as an integrated agenda. We are looking at the synergies that are evident across the agenda and trying to harness those synergies as part of our approach in financing, as part of our approach to implementing the agenda. So the idea of just multiple vertical funds is, of course, not coherent with such an approach. But this is not to deny the possibility that some targeted, quote-unquote, vertical interventions may be necessary to address certain critical gaps in the whole architecture. So in our approach as co-facilitators, we are not taking any options off of the table in terms of how we will seek to finance the agenda and how we will seek to approach the implementation of the agenda. We are seeking to keep as many options open as possible. So we refer to the possibility of global funds in some respects, especially as it relates to certain key social interventions on education, on health, healthcare health system strengthening, I think, has come somewhat to the fore, particularly in the wake of the Ebola situation. Hopefully it is not a fashionable flash of the moment, but I think the need for strengthening health and education as important underpinnings, questions of nutrition, which are in part unfinished business of the MDG agenda, I think will be very important as part of the foundation for building towards post-2015, the achievement of the post-2015 development agenda, the goals that we are about to agree on. So we see the need for key interventions to help to unlock the implementation of the larger agenda. So one dimension of that is those social interventions to which I referred. How can we help countries to address the challenges in health and education, in other critical social services? The idea has emerged, for example, of seeking of what can we do to help to unlock the potential of the billion or so people who are currently below poverty lines across the globe, but who have no less talent, no less ability, no less potential than the richest in the world. But they lack the opportunity to make that talent and that ability available for their own advancement and for the good of the human family as a whole. So some have spoken of this as a sort of a global floor. Some, I've heard the expression, a Bolsa Familia Global. So, of course, this would entail actions at the national level. So it's not a global fund to simply try to send money all over the globe to help poor people. It is something that will require policies at the national level, something that will require measures at the national level, what constitutes that critical cohort that will require that intervention that will lift the floor of opportunity. And the way I would think of it is lifting the floor of opportunity, unlocking the potential of those who are facing particular challenges of poverty and deprivation, and helping them to fulfill the purpose of their coming into this world. Now, in addition to that, we see a number of key areas of intervention which we see as having cross-cutting relevance for the SDGs and the post-2015 development agenda. One of these is in the area of infrastructure. So we call for a global initiative on sustainable and resilient infrastructure. This is a big demand here in Africa. It's a big demand in many parts of the world. There is a need to re-engineer infrastructure to make it more climate resilient. There is a need, of course, for new infrastructure, and setting that infrastructure against sustainability parameters will be important. So the question of infrastructure, we believe, will be very important to the overall implementation of the post-2015 development agenda. And it is one of the areas that the outcome seeks to profile. We have, of course, a number of initiatives on the way in this area. The World Bank, it was mentioned yesterday. The G20, for example. We have a lot of southern partners who have a lot of experience on infrastructure. And the idea would be to try to see if we can link those efforts, if we can promote enhance mutual learning, if I might say so, in the effective and efficient delivery of infrastructure programs, sustainable infrastructure programs. So this linking of efforts, linking of experiences, and getting a better sense of the need and the demand, I think would be an important contribution to the overall infrastructure implementation. In speaking of infrastructure, of course, we define it broadly, including energy infrastructure, transport, other areas that would be very important. And energy, of course, is a very important key. No one needs convincing on the importance of energy to sustainable development, to enabling economies and people to unlock the potential for growth and for addressing the challenges of poverty. In many countries, some of them small island developing states, many African countries face particular challenges in the area of energy. So we are hoping that one of the deliverables of ADIS will be an agreement to launch such an initiative on infrastructure, including energy. We see also the need for similar initiatives, scaling up action in the area of agriculture, rural development, where, of course, the bulk of poor people are to be found in rural areas, many of them women, and many of them hugely dependent on agriculture. We also see the potential for initiatives in small and medium enterprise development, and of course in protecting ecosystems, supporting the protection of ecosystems, and in that regard, addressing the broad dimensions of the agenda, the economic, the social, and the environmental. A number of specific areas, of course, continue to be relevant. The question of revenue, domestic resource mobilization, the question of tax administration and international tax cooperation. The document speaks to these issues. The question of illicit financial flows. We contemplate global action, strengthen global action in these areas. The role of business, and here I am, of course, very sensitive to the cautions that were echoed yesterday on business, but I think there are some examples, maybe increasingly so, of business aligning their business plans with sustainability criteria. Can we use the good examples to incentivize a broader approach, engagement by business in helping us to reach our goals? We could not fight climate change without the engagement of business. We could not, and we believe business has a lot of potential to contribute to the achievement of our goals as a responsible partner. And we contemplate in the outcome document building on the Monterey Foundation in facilitating private sector engagement in our efforts. Fostering the role of South-South cooperation, I think you will find some encouragement, some incentive to Southern partners to play a larger role. Of course, we understand the different debates about the relationship between South-South cooperation and traditional North-South or ODA, but I think it's important that we give scope for all partners to play the role that they can. And of course, we will have debates about the balancing of roles, but certainly our objective would be to ramp up the commitment and the contribution of all partners to the best of our respective abilities. We We also contemplate on the question of ODA, pushing the envelope a bit. You will see some very precise language on ODA. We are contemplating the idea of reaching the ODA target within defined time frames. This is a very old, long-standing objective, and I think it will be an important signal, at least from our point of view as co-facilitators, that there is some sense of a target. I think this is not new. I think we've had some leadership within the EU on this in the past, where they, in fact, had set a target to reach the 0.7 by 2015. But of course, there have been some slippages in that, the achievement of that objective. So we are providing added incentive for a serious look at this, so that together, because ODA remains an important signal of our commitment. Of course, there is a strong expectation of action at the national level. There is increasing expectation that emerging economies and so on can play a greater role. And so ODA in that overall context remains very important. I think it's important that our partnership globally is built on the foundation of commitments that are fulfilled, or commitments to which there is demonstrated effort to fulfill. I think we have to have a genuine partnership. It's unfortunate that we have to use adjectives for some of these key principles of international relations, but we hope to build on the foundation of a genuine partnership, a strong commitment by all concerned. And let me just, in closing, mention in terms of some of the tools that we envisage. I think there's been a growing recognition of the role of development banks, including national development banks, regional development banks, and of course the multilateral development banks. I think there is a sense that there's a lot more that those institutions can do in helping to intermediate, in helping to mobilize resources for development. And we contemplate in the outcome that there will be a greater role for those kinds of institutions. We contemplate the strengthening, of course, of markets, financial markets, the promotion of financial inclusion nationally. And I think you will find a strong theme on the gender front in the proposed draft outcome. I think it's one of the strongest documents in terms of gender equality and the empowerment of women as key actors in the overall global effort to promote development. So I will, I think, stop at this point. I've given you a bit of a random flavor of the document. But in closing, let me just say, we see three broad elements in the Addis outcome. One, of course, is an updated, upgraded framework anchored on sustainable development, the financing of sustainable development. Secondly, the identification and launching of key initiatives, feasible initiatives, key deliverables that will be complementary and integral to the effective outworking of the framework and the implementation of the post-2015 development agenda. And third is how we use the follow-up process, which I think was one of the weak elements in the Monterrey and the Doha conferences. How can we use the follow-up process more effectively to advance implementation, to identify the critical gaps as they emerge and to catalyze increasing action globally to achieve our common objectives. So thank you very much for the opportunity to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for that keynote. One, because it's so bang up to date in terms of where you are on the thinking, and I think to hear from you directly your sort of nuance and your interpretation is especially interesting. And secondly, for delivering so fulsomely on the question proposition, I think there's some really clear points and recommendations. Just while the panel is assembling, we will make a slight adjustment to the timetable. We've got a really rich panel, which Susan will introduce in a minute, but we'll probably run until around 11, just after 11 or so on this panel to make sure we have a good opportunity for discussion. We'll then slightly shorten the coffee break, and then the speed eating will be even speedier. And we will have caught up by lunch. That's my commitment. Anyway, we're almost there, and I'll hand over to Susan, your session chair. Thank you.
Hello? Oh, that works. Excellent. Thank you to Ambassador Talbot for laying out what we're all here to talk about and what we'll continue talking about through the rest of the day. I think that was it's a really clear framing of what we can expect in the outcome document, and I think will help with our discussions for the rest of the day. This panel is focused on looking at some emerging research, and I think it actually touches on a number of issues that are also included in the outcome document. So it's quite a wide-ranging panel involving quite a few eminent folks who will be able to share some of the research and the evidence that they have been looking at that touches on issues ranging from the focus on, the missing focus on middle-income countries, infrastructure for development, chronic poverty, international tax cooperation, and use of country systems. So we've got quite a spectrum of things that we'll be discussing. Before introducing folks on the panel, I just also wanted to introduce myself. I've been working with ODI and a project called Development Progress over the last few years, and you heard a little bit about what we've been finding from that project from Romilly yesterday in terms of outcomes in case studies of where development outcomes have improved. And there's been a lot of financing lessons from that from the past. And I think we've also found an equal number of challenges in those case studies. And I think some of the issues that we're discussing here today are those kind of chronic challenges that you really do see in countries as they try to progress. So these are important issues to be looking at. On the panel, and I think actually I'll introduce just a quick overview of folks and then come back to introductions as we go through them. We've got Andrew Rogerson, who is a senior research associate at ODI. Amadou, who's a senior fellow and director of the Brookings Africa Growth Initiative. Charles Lwanga Ntale, who's the regional director for East and Central Africa with Development Initiatives. Matthew Martin, who's Director of Development Finance International. Peter Chowla, who's an Economic Affairs Officer at UN-DESA. And Joan Stott, who is Senior Public Financial Management Specialist with CAPRI. So we're going to start off with Andrew. And I don't know, do you want to speak from the podium? Okay, and Andrew is going to be taking us through a bit of some of the highlights and what this means for financing for development from some research he's been doing on a rough roadmap to financing the SDGs. So over to Andrew.
Hi, yes, it looks like it's working. I'm very sorry I wasn't with you yesterday, and I'm going to try to follow the script and stick to output or outcome suggestions for the FFD process, but I will give you a little bit of context. First of all, to say, to quote my old friend and colleague Helmut Reisen, I am a recovering bureaucrat, which means that I'm not speaking for any of the agencies that I've worked in the past, which include the World Bank, the Department for International Development, and the OECD, nor any participant, of course, in the FFD process. So please take all of this as my personal view and with a pinch of salt. I will, however, be citing work that we've done together with colleagues from Brookings, and also implying a knowledge of the paper that Romilly presented yesterday, but I won't go into any details. First of all, by way of sort of who are the questions that the skeptics need to be convinced by if Addis Ababa is going to be satisfy expectations, I'll put it that way. And the first number that I wanted to remind you of, and this comes from Tony Karas actually, is 30-30, 130. The world of today, it's actually 192, but forget about the two, is comprised of 30 countries that are and will remain for the foreseeable future to 2030. Probably aid dependent, certainly low income. There are also 30 sort of classic, chronic donors, countries that see themselves as having obligations and commitments by way of foreign assistance, and include some big new ones. And then there are 130 that are in neither category, and that's, I think, the rub, and that's where we have to ask the question, what's in it for them? In particular, if aid is aid, as Ambassador Ntale was talking about it, it's good that there is a sort of more muscle being put into the historic ODA commitments, we hope, on the part of the EU and others. But is that enough, or is it sort of really quite beside the point in terms of what the world needs now, and where big new money is going to be unlocked? My colleague in some of the work we're doing now on FFD, Alex Evans, passionately believes that it's carbon trading that's going to release amounts of money that absolutely dwarf everything we've been talking about here today in terms of flows from the north to the south. More deeply than that, upper middle income countries in general, why should they commit to anything in particular? What's in it for them? And what's the quid pro quo? And that's, of course, a big question as part of the end game of Addis. And then overcoming the reluctance, but as Ambassador Ntale was saying, everything is interconnected. But some of the payoff of some of the deals will only come at Paris or maybe beyond, and why make a commitment in advance? Okay, enough of that sort of my feeble attempt at exploring some of the politics. I wanted to just remind you of a quick framework. Don't take too much notice of the circles. They are indeed the International Committee of Experts' way of organising, the Open Working Group's way of organising the SDGs into three sort of manageable but overlapping blocks. But look at the squares. We decided to take a look at concessional public finance, which is what Romilly was talking about yesterday, but also domestic resource mobilizations, as we think they have some of the same attributes. That's the blue box. We decided to focus very much, and that's what I'll be talking about in a minute, market-related public borrowing, ranging from the bond markets, which have been talked about, to, in particular, the role of official funders, be they national, regional, or multilateral, as Ambassador Ntale was mentioning. And then, of course, every other part of private finance, other than, of course, the bond markets as such. In a nutshell, here are three recommendations. You've heard the first one, and I'm not going to go back into it, and that's about concessional assistance, looking primarily at the international component of it. This needs to be redirected towards the most vulnerable, and above all, these credit-worthy countries. Our analysis is very much that rule of law questions drive credit ratings, and that there is a lot more capacity to take on responsible debt in a whole range of countries, but you have to acknowledge there are some countries that simply don't have that access and don't have tax capacity. I'm not going to go into that any further. What I am going to talk about is market-related public borrowing. We need a lot more of it. It's just not acceptable that the MDB system as a whole, the RDBs, are basically still doing in nominal terms about what they were doing in the 1980s, in their terms, abstracting from spikes of political crises where they act as a co-insurer. So we need more of that, much more of it, for countries that are doing relatively better on the spectrum, and this is what has come to be known also as the missing middle, or the missing middle in this context. And finally, private finance. I think there's a lot of discussion about what to do. I'm not going to touch on it, but just to remind you that we need good projects to begin with. The gap is not only a gap in capacity of the system to fund it. Okay, here's my colleague Annalisa's key point on the missing middle. On the top blue line, you have the combination of tax and external international public finance, be it on concessional or non-concessional terms, and it continues to decline well into upper middle income territory. And the reason it does is, look at the yellow line, that is the official finance plus ODA, which drops steadily to begin with, and then once you're into middle income, low middle income territory, it drops sharply. Of course, taxes, still as a percentage of GDP, do start to rise, and thank goodness, but they don't rise nearly as fast. And therein lies the rub. Another quick way of looking at it, I'm sorry if you can't see the names of the individual countries, some of you, your countries are represented there. If you take a snapshot, and this is using a different database from a paper released by Brookings recently, you see that precisely in the low middle income country territory, you get this trough of the total amount of aid and tax available, and that is part and parcel of the missing middle problem. What can we do about it? And here I think it's a central part of recommendations. We really need to have a better grip on how we meet the demand for non-concessional multilateral development bank financing. And I say multilateral development bank, of course I'm including the new players like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the new development bank. Assuming that demand is still robust, and there are good encouraging signs coming out of the World Bank and elsewhere that there is a sort of resurgence potentially of demand, then we need to find a way of accommodating that demand, and there are some roadblocks which all of you are aware of in the back of your mind. They include the legendary refusal of the US Congress, and here I'm speaking on Ntale, on personal capacity, to provide new capital for a window of the IBRD, which essentially serves as the global competitors of the United States. So there are structural problems in bringing new capital in. They've been resolved in different ways. One of them, which has been adopted by the Asian Development Bank, is to leverage the receivables. Yeah. Another is to smooth the graduation to market-related funding, and the new IDA Plus tool of that has been proposed inside the World Bank is an excellent potential way out of this. So we are at the point, at the cusp of a quite exciting change in the structure of MDBs. But we also need to improve competitiveness. What I'm not going to go into, but I will talk about in the Speed League session, is I think that South-South providers, particularly the very large ones, need to be provided with incentives to declare far more of what they're doing in the so-called market-related finance, export credits from China, and so on. And we could even go so far as to have a new target. I'm not going to go into private finance, but those are the sort of basic chapter headings that we have. And I'm not going to go into a market rate index. I'll just close with saying all this applies, of course, to climate finance in spades. We suggest that you should finance mitigation mainly on market-related loan terms, with some exceptions which we discussed. And we also think that concessional systems for adaptation, like all IPF, should be targeted at the most vulnerable countries. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew. I think we're going to move swiftly on to our next speaker. Amadou is, again, he's with the Brookings Institute. And he's going to be talking a bit about some research that they've been doing on financing African infrastructure and changing the role of external as well as public domestic finance as a part of that. It looks like Amadou is adept at his own IT work as well. So over to you, Amadou.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. And so there's been a lot of talks about matching the uses, the sources of finance with the uses of finance. So what we have tried to do in a paper that will be forthcoming in a couple of weeks is to focus on the specific case of infrastructure in Africa and look at the different sources of finance and then see where exactly they are going in terms of sectors and even in terms of subsectors. So I think I have about 8 minutes, so I'll go a little bit quicker than I usually do. But so there have been recent trends. So in 2009, the World Bank published a flagship report on infrastructure in Africa. Most of the figures that you will hear about the financing the infrastructure gap in Africa, this 93 billion or 100 billion, come from that World Bank report that was in 2009. So we really look at what has happened since then. So you will see that there is indeed a surge in financing infrastructure in Africa, both external and internal sources of finance. You will see that there is a growing importance of private participation in infrastructure and the non-traditional sources, mainly China. You see also that traditional multilateral banks are still relevant in certain sectors and subsectors, and that in spite of all the focus on external finance, when it comes to infrastructure, domestic financing remains the largest source of finance. And finally, we find a wide distribution of financing across countries, and we also see some micro patterns in sectors, and we also even look at subsectors. So here we have the external financing in infrastructure in Africa, and you will see that since 2004, the volumes of financing of infrastructure in Africa have tripled. And this is true for all sources. This is true for ODF. This is true for China. It is true for the private sector. So, but this is a bit misleading because there is some concentration. I mean, there's a lot of concentration actually in the recipient countries, and you can talk about the big five. You have South Africa and Nigeria, but also Ghana, Kenya, and Ethiopia, that basically take more than half of the financing flows in the infrastructure sector. Lately, about the energy sector is really the one which is increasingly attracting financing. Before that, it was the telecom sector, which is now maturing. So there are some questions really about the next phase of telecom investment in Africa, as we moving from the mobile phone and the cell phone towers to broadband and so on. If you look at the private sector financing, though, although it has increased very fast, the average numbers mask some very important disparities, because most of the money that has come to Africa from the private sector has gone to the telecom sector. And for obvious reasons, You know, you just need to build a few cell phone towers. The money is ring-fenced, you know, so government is not involved, you know, so it's really very well designed for the telecom sector, and hence it has attracted. So this is one big achievement of the private sector, really, is that it has financed this big boom in the telecom sector in Africa, and it has been very profitable too. Electricity, as I said earlier, is coming very fast. But again, if you look at the subsectors, most of the money is going into generation. So it's important for us to look at the subsectors even, if you are thinking about sustainable development goals. Again, the top recipient of private sector, you know, originally I talked about the big five, which included Ethiopia. When it comes to the private sector, Ethiopia is not there anymore. You find South Africa and Nigeria, which are the top two, but also Kenya, Tanzania, and Ghana. So, yeah. So, if you look at, again, the private sector, and you look at the countries that receive private sector money, you will find that about 40 countries receive private sector money. But if you remove the telecom sector, the ICT sector, you only find 21 countries that receive private sector money. Again, this importance of looking at the sectoral level, even the subsectoral level. ODF, Official Development Finance, so we pooled the ODA and the money from the multi-development banks, is still relevant. It's increasing. Money from the World Bank, African Development Bank, and the OECD DAC in infrastructure is increasing. It has increased. And it's particularly relevant in this non-ICT. So basically, the ODF is financing the sectors other than the telecom sectors. So maybe this is serendipitous, but it's an important complement here that we have seen. Chinese financing is also growing very rapidly, and interestingly, it's going into some sectors that are not financed by other players. In particular, if you take transport, which takes more than half of Chinese financing, this is really a sector where almost only China is really present. Nobody else will build railroads, and they are very present in the roads. They are also present in the energy system. So the Chinese financing also is shifting emphasis. If you look at the recent period, 2009 to 2012, you'll see that they have increased the financing of the non-resource rich countries. So there was this, especially in Washington, this big idea that China is only financing resource rich countries, but it seems that the financing is shifting emphasis. China is also financing more the stable economies, and the share of Chinese financing to fragile low income has gone down when it comes to infrastructure. So we find also some disturbing trends, in the sense that we are concerned by the fact that subnational and urban infrastructure is ignored. And this is, we think, this is very important if you look at the demographic trends and the urbanization trend in Africa. We think that there should be an emphasis on facilitating projects because they have ignored sometimes governance, coordination, and efficiency gains. It's not just about building infrastructure, it's not about building new infrastructure, it's about also the maintenance of the old infrastructure and the productivity gains from the current system of infrastructure. We find a complementarity in the financing. As I said, the private sector going to telecom, the official sector going to other sectors like water, and China going to transport, but maybe it's just purely serendipitous. We don't think it was coordinated. And we find that traditional coordination mechanisms are ill-suited in the new economic environment with new and multiple stakeholders. And we see a bigger role for development banks, and in Africa for the African development banks. So I really like this table because in this table what we have tried to do is look at the sources of finance and the uses of finance by sectors, and we even go in the subsectors. So you will see, as I said earlier, for example, that in the energy sector, all the players are interested. Everybody is interested in the energy sector. In the telecom sector, the private sector could do it alone. But if you take transportation, you see that there are less players. If you dig deeper and you go in the subsectors, you will see that the government is involved into all sectors of transportation. But when it comes to railroads, for example, and roads, you will find mostly that the private sector is not present there. So, we've also looked at domestic revenues, and you'll see just quickly that if you look at non-oil exporting countries, the tax to GDP ratio has increased and is higher than 20%, but you see that on the resource-rich countries, there's some volatility there. In good times, they can raise more, in bad times, they raise less. So we have a number of recommendations, and you know, this is a bit cryptic, and I don't have time to go into it, but the paper is forthcoming I think in a couple of weeks, and we would look forward to your comments. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Amadou. I think it's really useful to understand a little bit more about the resource pathways into Africa and kind of the fact that external revenues have tripled, but there's issues in terms of where those resource flows are going, to which countries and to which sectors, and the real challenges of coordination around them. I can see that through your presentation you had a proposal around particularly the role of banks, some of the international development banks, in terms of working with that coordination, and I think during the questions it'll be good to hear a little bit more about some of your specific recommendations for FFD, particularly given infrastructure will be one of the key areas it focuses on. Now we'll move on to hear from Charles Lwanga Ntale. Again, he works with the development initiatives as the regional director for East and Central Africa. He's also associate director with the Chronic Poverty Action Network, and he'll be sharing with us some analysis on chronic poverty in Eastern Africa that has been taken from a few different reports. So go ahead, Charles.
Thank you very much, Susan. Good morning. When you speak after Amadou, you have to adjust the microphone, of course. I'll begin by saying that it's a good way listening, first of all, to the two presenters because all those things are quite necessary. What I want to bring in this is the perspective of the people for whom this is meant, is always meant. We draw the lessons I'm going to share with you from a number of pieces of research, one of which is just concluding on chronic poverty in Eastern Africa. By this I mean countries covered by the East African Community, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, and to an extent countries bordering Ethiopia and Somalia. And the lessons that we learned from the research that is going to be published in about a month's time. We're also using evidence from research that has been undertaken globally by the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network, where a publication is already out in the Global Report 2014-2015, and also our work on data and information for transparency. Now, I was told many years back by my teacher that if you're speaking to a group of people among whom there's likely to be an economist, even just one, begin with your conclusions. So I'll go straight to the conclusions first, and then work backwards. First, our evidence is that a very large number of people live in extreme and chronic poverty. We're talking about the bottom 20% of the population in the world. In some cases, it goes to 40% in some countries. In some subnational situations, you're talking about 60 or 70%. So huge numbers of people. One of the things that we need to get out of this is that any financing for the future, the narrative has to be about a poverty-free world, a poverty-free Africa. Secondly, socio-economic and other forms of exclusion still persist. And there are not many adequate ways for addressing these kinds of issues. And we think that a fund for social protection is absolute necessity. And this, of course, has to be discussed. How does this work, etc. But let's get to that point in due course. Third, there is quite a lot of emphasis in much of what we talk about on income and income issues, which is important itself. But we know at the same time that dealing with poverty is a multidimensional issue, and therefore, when we talk about resourcing, we need to think about this multidimensionality and the challenges faced by the people that I'll be talking about later. Fourth, capacity gaps, and this has been highlighted quite a few times. Capacity gaps do exist amongst all partners, including donors. And this is an area that I think we should consistently and continuously reflect on, so that when we talk about capacity building in the financing for the future, we think about capacity building for all in the partnership. Fifth, we think that there is still a need for a lot more resources. If one just stood and said resources increasing in terms of domestic resource mobilization, the tendency is for us to look at what is needed now or what was needed yesterday, rather than what is needed tomorrow. And if we're going to achieve the ambitions that we have, we should be talking more about a lot more resources, and hence the need for recommitment to the 0.7%, potentially, hopefully, more. But that's not something we'd like to put on the table. And finally, in terms of our conclusions, we need to invest in better data and information, and also make sure that data and information are more on demand, rather than just the supply side of data and information. Let's get to know a little bit more about what policymakers need, what their constraints are, what communities need, what local governments need, what other development players need. Now, I'll go to the specifics. In terms of the issues to do with the magnitude of poverty, especially chronic poverty, our work in Eastern Africa tells us that at least 20 million people, this is out of a population of about 140, at least 20 million are in chronic poverty. This is a huge number. It's about the size of almost 2/3 of the population of Ghana, or of the population of Cameroon. And even our description of who is in poverty is a very generous, in an opposite way actually. The poverty line is so low that even if one were just walking, they would be able to cross it. So it's a low-hanging fruit that we're talking about. So we're talking about a huge number of poverty. If the figures in terms of income were raised by even just about 50 cents, we might well be talking about more than half the population. It's significant to note that a large number of people in chronic and extreme poverty are actually working poor. These are not people who are not doing nothing. And many of them are actually private sector workers, often called informal sector workers. So the tendency for us to think that those who are in the private sector are not in poverty, actually, we have the evidence that those who are in the informal sector workers, many of them working very hard, are in poverty, and we need to address that. There still remains exclusion of specific categories of people, people with disabilities, women, ethnic minorities, etc. These issues are still out there, and when we talk about financing for the future and the role of international public finance, we need to think about that. However, the poverty picture is very complex. Unfortunately, in a way, what you see in this bar chart also reflects a major challenge. One of the countries that have been driving development in the East African region is Kenya, very well known for its efforts. But the last household survey that we have for Kenya was in 2005. So data, we don't know. Now, even based on that, what the data tells us is that 45%, almost 46%, were in poverty, using the headcount measure. That's significant. So while on one hand we might be doing all these other fantastic things, the question is, where are the people? What's happening to the people? When you come to public goods, these are seriously threatened, and this, the evidence again shows very clearly. When you look at the case for Tanzania, for example, the red line there shows you the 1990 situation, and the blue line, the 2010 situation. That's how much the changes have happened. The evidence is that those countries that are spending very little are also with the most poverty, very little purchasing power parity per person. Most governments in East Africa spend about $500 on average per person. And you can see on the extreme left, Burundi, Uganda, Rwanda, and then Tanzania comes in, and then Kenya. And every other country is further on. That's a challenge. The issue of data is still a big issue. We don't know who the poor, where the poor are. We don't know what their trajectories are, livelihood trajectories. We don't know what their needs sometimes are, and the need for, therefore, panel data and a demand-led data revolution becomes relevant. We think that donors are also not revealing as much as they should. Governments are always demanding for information and data, but they find all kinds of challenges. And data is not always politically neutral in any sense. When you talk about $1 a day poverty, and you say, well, we think it should be $1.25, that becomes a political question. Because the moment you do that, then you're going to raise the number of people, and then the government will look bad, that they're not doing very well. So you have political questions even about data. There are specific proposals that we put on the table, and these are consistent with the proposals that we have in the global report as well. One, we need to tackle poverty directly. Make sure that we have inclusive plans and budgets. We also need to stop impoverishment, and social protection is one way of doing that. And this could be linked between welfare objectives, production objectives, and addressing vulnerability all simultaneously. And three, sustaining poverty escapes through linked up provision, so that those that escape are able to actually latch onto something else. Now, on the data question, this is my final point. You might have seen some of my colleagues outside looking at the data, looking at the development data hub. And we think it's important to make data accessible, usable, and easy to manipulate. If you haven't had time, please find time to look at the data hub just outside. There are 3 hotspots that you can have a look at and reflect. I'll be happy to listen to any points. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Charles. That was a really good reminder and/or overview around the scale of the challenge of much of what we're talking about with development in terms of the fact that extreme and chronic poverty makes up between 20 and 40% of many developing country populations, at least 20 million people in East Africa. And we heard a few different proposals from you as well around a global fund for social protection, new agriculture financing, recommit to the 0.7, and of course, better data and information. So those are definitely some things to mull over, and I think some things that it sounds like we do see in the outcome document already. So it may be more the details of what's in there. I'm going to turn over now to Matthew Martin, Director of DFI, and he'll be speaking from here without a PowerPoint, and we'll look at 8 key problems of the financing for development and propose some solutions based on a series of different research that he's been involved in. So over to Matthew.
Thank you very much, Susan. For those of you who don't know, Development Finance International is a non-profit organisation which has been working for 20 years with about 70 different low-income and low-income countries to do research, and indeed with donors, NGOs and so on, to do research, analysis, capacity building and advocacy to help those countries get better financing for their development. And as a result, we've been doing so many things in relation to FFD that I found it rather impossible to actually choose one to summarise. So I thought I would just bring together a whole set of work, but probably the most important of that is a forthcoming report we're going to launch jointly with Oxfam on April the 13th in New York, which takes a fairly unique perspective on these issues by looking through what we call the Government Spending Watch project at 70 countries' budget financing and taking, if you like, more of a bottom-up perspective on how this money is getting to countries' budgets and what impact that's having. But there's also a lot of work I've been doing for the UN Development Cooperation Forum, which works closely with the FFD team on the future of development cooperation, private and labor cooperation, mutual accountability. A report I did last year with Eurodad and DI to the European Parliament on relative roles of public, blended and private finance, work for various people on debt and multilaterals roles, real aid reports and various successor reports for those for action aid. And we have we run with the Homophobia network of 77 Francophone finance ministers who meet regularly and have a research program linked to that to look at these issues. So I'm joined on all of those. First problem, and the one we have to solve, probably won't be solved in earnest, but it has to be solved during this year. Massive additional financing need. People talk about trillions of dollars for the SDGs, but they also talk about hundreds of billions being needed in IPF because a large part can come from private sector funding and budget revenue, but if you actually look, as we did last year, at net flows, some of the things you hear about private flows dwarfing official flows are not true. Official flows are bigger, not just for these developed countries, but for almost all low-income countries and a large number of low-middle-income countries. And equally, there are some issues which arose here yesterday, I'm sure will arise again, about the much lower willingness and ability of private finance to do really stretch things about reaching certain countries, reaching the poorest, reaching certain sectors. So there are two solutions on that one. One is, this is rubbish, this aspect that people are talking globally about aid budgets are constrained and falling. Yes, there is a crisis in some countries, but some donor countries are using the crisis as an excuse to do things they have wanted to do for some time, like generating budget surpluses, off the backs of the world's poorest people. So we need to be clear about that. There are some donors who could continue to move towards 0.7, and it would be ideal to have some new targets and timetables for that. But even so, even if we had 0.7 from everybody, that would not be enough. And we cannot get away from the need for global innovative financing, for global public taxes, whether it's financial transaction taxes, carbon taxes, telecom taxes, and let's not forget the IMF has the global power to print money and issue SDRs. So for me, that would be the #1 priority. Otherwise, we get into a situation of fighting over slices of a shrinking pie, whether it's for countries or sectors. In terms of countries, second problem, there are big allocation problems, as we heard yesterday from the countries, all the different groups that we talked about. So yes, we do need a higher percentage of aid to go to fragile post-conflict states, other vulnerable countries. But we also need concessional financing for middle-income countries, notably for social and environmental spending. And my suggestion would be that those countries should not graduate until they have reached the SDGs in their countries, the relevant SDGs, and that would be before 2030. We need, therefore, I agree with Andrew, to mobilise more funds, but I would say through a much more nuanced range of concessionality. I raised the issue of missing middle about 2 years ago in front of the UK Parliamentary Committee. And my attitude there was we need semi-concessional financing. We don't need market equivalent, because the multilaterals and bilateral global finance institutions should do their job of intermediating money and give us money that's somewhere halfway between the current concessional windows and market-based conditions. And we've helped the African Development Bank to move in that direction already. But we also need a really strong global monitoring. OECD does some, but not enough, of where the money is going, which countries are underaided, and how we can use the multilateral institutions to rebalance funds so that it's not just a question of the donor darlings getting all the money and other countries not. Then the third problem is sector balance. Now, we have massive financing gaps, and something we're analysing a lot in the Government Spending Watch report. There are the MDGs which are more ambitious in existing areas. There are new goals in the SDGs, notably social protection and resilience. And there are huge cross-cutting issues, climate, gender, inequality, and so on. I've always been very sceptical about global funds. We need to avoid more parallel institutions. But I think provided you follow the OECD principles for good global funds and avoid bad practices, it would probably still be better to channel money through regional institutions which are really owned by developing countries. But for sectors like social protection and smallholder agriculture, which really need a global kick up the backside in terms of mobilising more money, they probably are a good idea. But we also really need two other things. One is to regularly monitor and adjust what is happening globally in terms of sector balance, so we don't, for example, have a massive fall-off of donor commitments to primary education, which has happened in the last 5 years. And we need every single aid project to be screened for the cross-cutting issues, for its impact on climate change, on gender, and on other aspects of equality. Then we get to the fourth problem, quality issues. Yesterday we heard a lot about the problems that countries are having with aid, how the aid effectiveness agenda, if you like, is not moving forward as they would hope. When we look at the budgets, we find a lack of support for recurrent spending, lots of projects being built and then falling apart, notably in wash and agriculture. We find massive delays in disbursements and a really clear correlation between the degree to which countries or sectors are dependent on donor funding and the delays in those sectors. And we've long heard at country level that it's donor procedures that are mainly responsible for delays in disbursement, and that is being re-underlined again. We find virtually no predictability, virtually no country is receiving any reports from its donors of what they plan to do over the next 3 years as they promised to do so. We find in quite a few countries which have long been post-conflict, I think of Liberia and Timor-Leste, that there is still virtually no on-budget aid in those countries at all, and there is virtually no progress on accountability, genuine accountability, holding individual donors accountable for what they're doing. So I think we cannot content ourselves in Addis with a reaffirmation that isn't it wonderful we have a global partnership on effective development cooperation and urging people to do Lucerne. We need to identify precisely the areas where progress is not being made and talk about those in detail and make really strong recommendations that the global partnership needs to be reinvigorated and there needs to be progress on. On blended finance, the next problem, and finance for the private sector, of course, as we've heard, this can be very desirable, but there are some really huge problems in measuring what's going on, and, for example, whether it is really catalysing, whether the use of official finance to catalyse the private sector is actually mobilising additional money. There are huge transparency and accountability problems and impact problems. So my suggestion here would be we need a very clear set of criteria for which projects and companies should be funded in terms of the relative contribution to the SDGs, in terms of perhaps reaching the poorest, but also people need to commit to not funding and working with egregious tax avoiding companies. And we need to have really good criteria for measuring impact, such as decent job creation and tax pay in the developing countries. I think probably on this the most we can hope for from FFD is agreement on a process to get such criteria together, and I would hope some commitments from the more development-oriented private sector like UN-DESA to join in that process. Next problem, dealing with shocks. A lot of what we did in the simulations yesterday was based on countries being hit by shocks. The current global shocks architecture is really appalling. Lack of resources, excessive conditionality on the economic side, and a huge and growing shortfall in funding for natural disasters and refugees. We've got to make it a priority in Addis to do everything we can to help the G20 sort out the IMF and World Bank governance issues so that we can get on with large quota and capital increases for the IMF and World Bank and push for continued rises in their concessional windows. And we've also got to make sure that we don't marginalise the most marginalised, those suffering from disasters and refugees in Addis. We need to keep those issues at the centre of discussions in Addis. And I would suggest setting a goal to maintain the share of financing for refugees and disasters and increase financing for prevention and resilience programmes in Addis. And two more. One is preventing another debt crisis. So we heard yesterday a lot of stuff about costs of loans, but we've been doing some work looking at the potential. If you take all of the way that we're currently financing development and you project that forward 15 years to 2030, you take into account the massive rise in financing needs, the huge risks of the types of financing we were talking about yesterday. We could end up in 2030 or before then in many cases with massive risks for debt sustainability in more than 50 countries. We could end up having to cancel more than $500 billion worth of debt by 2030, which would be a massive diversion of funds away from spending money on the SDGs. So we've got to keep grants coming to countries with debt risks, and we've got to have much better systems for debt crisis prevention and rapid debt crisis resolution. And then finally, because I think it's important that we do realise, as we heard yesterday in the country session, that we need to look beyond IPF to what those providers of international public finance need to do about other types of funding. Partly because we can't really be sure that donors are prepared to fulfil their part of the effective development cooperation bargain, either in terms of quantity or quality, and partly because we, I'm sure, all share the goal that countries should become less aid dependent and more able to run their own lives in the future. So I would suggest two things here. One is to focus catalytic aid on funds which are most likely to have an SDG-related development impact, and that is essentially tax. A sharp increase in tax-related capacity building, not just flying in foreign expert support, focusing on combating exemptions, evasion, and making tax systems more progressive, and the types of capacity building support we heard from countries that needed yesterday, and information sharing support on innovative public financing, South-South cooperation, global taxes, etc., new private instruments, and fighting off crooks. And then the policy coherence stuff that we also heard about yesterday. So we need, if we were serious about making other types of FFD more possible, and I'm going to just focus on tax here when I think of about 20 different things to do, but on tax, it really would be a good idea if every country would commit, as the Dutch have already done, to renegotiating their tax treaties with developing countries, using more of a UN-based model, using more of a treaty which actually obliges countries to pay taxes in countries from which they get the natural resources on which they base all their profits. And linked to that, we shouldn't just be talking about goals and treaties and principles. All of the development financing institutions and the multilateral development banks ought to insist that the corporations they fund for private financing pay taxes in the country where they're doing the project, and not be lobbying, as many of them still are, both governments and multilateral and bilateral DFIs, for tax exemptions.
Great, thank you, Matthew. I think that threw out a lot of ideas of some of the priorities and some of the solutions that maybe should be proposed and discussed at Addis. From looking at better revenue through global public taxes to possibly having global funds as part of the answer in certain situations, to stronger recommendations on a global partnership, disaster and refugee financing, and catalytic aid on tax capacity building. So lots of ideas there. I think this actually transitions quite well to our next speaker, who is Peter Chowla, Economic Affairs Officer at UN-DESA, and he's going to be talking about international policies on tax cooperation. So over to you, Peter.
Thank you. And thank you for having me and inviting me to speak. Unlike Andrew, I'm not a preface everything by saying these are my personal views and not the views of the United Nations. Though largely what I'll say is based on the UN's World Economic Situation and Prospects, which is an annual publication we do. And this year, every year we do a chapter on international finance, and this year we had a bit more focus than usual on public finance side. And usually our chapter focuses on private finance and private financial flows. And this year we felt, in light of the conference, our international conference, we needed to be a bit more, look at some of the international flows as well. So a lot of what I'll say is in there, and I highly recommend people read that chapter, which was published in January. So we don't have much time, I understand, so I'm gonna just fly through some of this very quickly. You may have we've had a number of discussions about this. This is from the Intergovernmental Committee of Experts on Sustainable Development Finance, their report, Orders of Magnitude of Needs, which I think Romney's chart yesterday had a very nice chart which showed both the domestic and international finance and how much higher the gaps were. I mean, the figures are enormous in many sectors. I mean, lots of caveats about making needs assessment. It's very difficult, and you better off doing it nationally than internationally, because aggregating these figures is very difficult. And then you also have issues of synergies. You know, for the most famous example being that if you invest in water and sanitation, you solve a lot of your health and education. You help solve some of the health and education problems. And so adding these things up is not a good idea in that sense. But the figures are really enormous, and so we need to think about where the money will come from for some of this. I'll skip over this one. So we do every year a set of analysis of the net financial transfers from developing countries in this chapter of the World Economic Situation and Prospects. And except for LDCs, which is the top blue line, so you know, and these don't all add together because some of the categories are overlapping, just so you know. But the LDCs are the only ones that really do receive net financial transfers. When you add up the effect of private capital flows and the effect of, including remittances and aid, and the effect of investments in reserves. So which essentially is an outward flow from developing countries because they get invested in US treasuries usually, or in Euro bonds or other things. And so for most categories of countries, you actually see negative net transfers, despite increases in aid that we've seen. And this is a really important thing to understand, the context that on an economy-wide basis, there's a difficult problem here. And this is why some of the issues in international public finance, increasing those flows and making them more stable, predictable, and solving some of the taxation issues can be really important. Because when you're dealing with private finance, the flows are very volatile. And then to think about investment for the long term, it's very hard to use volatile capital flows. So I put up just the African numbers from this year's World Economic Situation and Prospects for the last couple of years. The chart has every region and global totals. You can see actually the FDI figures are fairly stable, but the problem is that you have much greater volatility in some of the other numbers. Now, and Africa actually looks, in terms of the portfolio flow volatility, pretty good compared to some other regions in the world, like Latin America, where you see very high volatility in the portfolio flows, which come into these countries. But what you do see in Africa more than in other countries is very high volatility, other regions, sorry, is very high other net investment volatility, and that's because, you know, we think that probably there's weak categorization and there's a lot of unknowns in African capital account data, so it ends up in this sort of other category. So other people have mentioned the importance of data, so I will also stress that. But you know, even at the net level, you know, swings from positive 20 or 60 billion to minus 25 billion is really difficult to deal with. So this is why, you know, we do think the public finance is really important. I wanted to just focus in on the international tax cooperation angle because, you know, it's you know, we had a lot of discussion yesterday about this, at least in terms of mentions of it, and the Amadou report was also mentioned, which is a really useful input into the process to talk about illicit financial flows in Africa. But it's a very technical and complex subject, and so I wanted to just go through a little bit of our thinking in terms of what are the issues that could be dealt with, and what are the issues that will need to be dealt with beyond the Addis Ababa conference after we've got some progress through the outcome there. The important thing that I wanted to stress is that tax evasion and tax avoidance is both a domestic and an international problem. There are things you can do at the domestic level. You can try to improve your tax administration. You can work on your tax base and broadening it. You can reduce exemptions, and you can crack down on the various illegality. But there's a limit to what you can do at the domestic level, because so much of the problems are international in nature. So we don't have an agreed definition of what illicit financial flows are. There is no, the IMF and the World Bank and the UN don't have an agreed definition. So I'll use basically this three-part definition, which is what's usually used in the literature, which covers criminal activity, which is money laundering, drug activity, environmental crime, etc. You've also got corruption, and then you've got commercial tax evasion and tax avoidance. And so some of this is not international in nature. Some of it is purely domestic, and then there are portions of it which are flowing international. Now, creating estimates of these things is very difficult, and this is another data issue which can be usefully dealt with in Addis. There are some estimates of offshore untaxed wealth which range from small trillions to double-digit trillions, and which is a lot of money when you're considering the sort of annual investment capacities of about 22 trillion is what you see new investment annually if you combine all international capital markets. That amount of resources, if it were to be taxed properly, might be quite significant. Even if you're only thinking about the returns being taxed. So if you have 30 trillion in resources and you have a 5% return, and then you think about a 35% tax rate on top of that, that's a large sum of money in the billions, which we're not making use of. Now, I'm thankful that Matthew mentioned the point around ODA on tax administration. So this off-cited figure of less than 0.1% of ODA on tax administration comes from the OECD, and it comes from the donors' own reporting of how they categorize their ODA flows. The number was 120 million in 2012, which is a very small proportion of the total that goes on some of the domestic tax administration issues. And so there are skills and capacity gaps. It's a lack of staff, and a lack of political will and investment in these sectors from both the donor and the domestic side. And that's something that domestically countries can work on, but it's also something that donors can contribute to, and that's a really important outcome we could see in Addis. And I think there's a question about how much donors are willing to invest in this, and whether they're willing to put hard commitments on how much money they want to, how much they want to scale up that investment in tax administration. However, at the international level, there are rules in how taxes are assessed internationally, which are really important to think about. And countries cannot solve that on their own. It's an international issue which requires international cooperation. I won't have time to go through all the details, but I want to stress the two things up here that have come up first, or three things, sorry. The distribution implications, that when you deal with tax reforms, you're dealing not only with, this is not new money. This is money that's in the economy somewhere. It may be new to the public sector to be able to realize it, and it will have implications between different kinds of businesses. So you have it right now in many countries an unlevel playing field where some international and multinational firms don't pay a lot of taxation, and that's an important consideration when you're thinking about holistic approaches to resource mobilization and economic development. So you have to think about what are the implications. Second, between states and businesses. So if we raise taxation revenue, that's going to have implications for the amount of cash and profits that are withheld by corporations. That will have economic implications, and it's important to think through, who has higher investment capacity and ability to use that resources for productive investment. And then finally, between states, and that's a really important one because the incentives are not aligned between the various countries. So, and that's particularly important when you're talking about OECD countries, which host currently most of the multinational corporations. But that is going to be a moving target as well, as we've seen increasing South-South business ties, trade, and investment. You will see an increasing number of large businesses hosted in emerging markets. And so the political economy of how you deal with tax cooperation is going to change over the next 15 years quite drastically, we imagine. So participation is really important, which brings me, I have to skip through some of this, that the venue for tax policy making is really fundamental, and who participates and on what level they participate at, and what is the nature of their participation. So, we have a UN tax committee, a committee of experts. It's not an intergovernmental committee. Lots of work goes on at the OECD. The OECD hosts a global forum, which is a bit broader, about double the size of OECD membership, but it's not universal. And so, we think there's an opportunity to restructure some of the international cooperation so that it's more inclusive and more participatory, and that it can more effectively bring in the voices and views of developing countries who have certain needs and capacity gaps which are important to address. And then the last thing I want to emphasize as I run out of time is that solving the venue question, which might be one thing we can get to in Addis Ababa this year, if member states are willing to deal with that, is not going to solve the problems of IFFs, of illicit financial flows. You have a lot of technical work to be done on fiscal transparency side, so that involves country by country reporting of profits, of sharing of tax information, both multilaterally and bilaterally, and beneficial ownership information. But you still have then problems with how you specify taxation systems, and whether you use arm's length pricing, which is the mechanism that is normally used under OECD guidelines, or whether we try to move to different kinds of systems of allocating economic activity for taxation. And then there's a whole range of associated issues which can also be addressed in Addis around the Convention Against Corruption, stolen assets, how we return some of those environmental crimes, which can all be given a boost out of the Addis process. But overall, I want to emphasize, which I think Matthew also talked about, that coherence questions are really important. It's not something that you can solve in a silo. It's something that has to be addressed in conjunction with other policies, because trade and investment policies will impact on your taxation policies as well. And for us, at the Financing for Development Office, we realize that the final follow-up process for the conference is really important, because these things don't get solved with one-off statements or declarations or accords. It's about continual work on the technical side to work with countries and to solve problems and to make sure nobody gets left behind. And having an inclusive follow-up process which deals with this issue will be really important in the long run. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. You started off by reminding us of the scale of the challenge, I think, and several hundreds of billions are going to be needed in terms of working towards the SDGs in the next years. Capturing some of these illicit financial flows would not be new money, but it would be new to the public sector. And so some of the suggestions you have around tax administration and capacity, addressing tax competition and fiscal transparency, and bringing more coherence across the sector are really essential. We have one more presentation, and this is Joan Stott, Senior Public Financial Management Specialist with CABRI. She's going to be bringing us back to the country level to cap off some of these discussions and looking at the use of country systems. So over to you, Joan.
Thank you very much, Susan. Morning, everyone. So I work for the Collaborative Africa Budget Reform Initiative, and we work with countries on public finance management reform issues, so improving transparency, accountability, and credibility of budgets. And one of our main areas of work is around aid transparency and the use of country systems. So what do we mean by the use of country systems? basically external financing coming to countries is incorporated as a starting point, possibly one level of a country system, so whether that's procurement, auditing, planning, or budgeting, and ultimately at all levels of the country systems within this process. So we refer to this as the willingness of donors to plan, manage, monitor, report, audit, and evaluate their aid resources using country rather than their own systems. So we want to avoid a situation where there are parallel systems running. Why is this important? We feel that when country systems aren't used, countries have less predictability and control over the resources that they are given. Also, recipients of these resources may not have as much access to this information. It might not be as transparent as if it was included within the country systems. So we recognize that the use of country systems is central to effective institutions. Donor aid that doesn't use country systems often, as I mentioned, reduces predictability of planning and budget processes and limits the control of the relevant ministries in planning and using these resources. So there's a need for more comprehensive, timely and reliable information provided by donors so that more predictability and control is there. And this means that as part of a forecasting process, for instance, there are more endogenous factors in the forecast than exogenous. So there's more understanding of when aid will flow, how much will flow, what sectors it will flow to, and whether this is a short-term flow or a long-term flow. This also has implications on communication and credibility of budget estimates, budget execution and service delivery, and overall support for improving the capacity of countries to manage their systems and improve the governance structures. So one of our documents actually came out with this statement, that aid management is bound up with public finance management, and most of the good practices for using country budget systems draw on the general principles of good public finance management, and making a stronger link between partner country strategies and increasing the effectiveness of aid and their strategies for strengthening public finance management. So just as a background, these are some of the global commitments that have already been made around the use of country systems. We had the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness in 2005, where partner countries agreed to undertake the necessary reforms to ensure that national systems and institutions for managing aid resources were effective, accountable and transparent. And donor countries agreed to use country systems to the maximum extent possible. This was restated within the Accra Agenda in 2008, and then the Busan Global Partnership in 2011 actually agreed that the default approach for development cooperation would be to use country systems, and this was agreed by all donors to that agreement. So these are just some of the publications that CABRI has on the use of country systems, and we did bring some of them with us. The rest are available on our website. And I'm going to speak now a bit about our findings from the 2014 study, so towards a greater use of country systems. So some of the key findings are that most countries have experienced an increase both in the use of public finance management and procurement systems between 2005 and 2010. The least used systems, though, remain the planning and budget systems. And we see that there are some donors, like the African Development Bank, that will use the audit systems as an entry point to using country systems. They may still use safeguards within that process, but limit the number of derogations that they require from that system. We also see that the increase in use of country systems is often preceded by an improvement in public finance reforms. But there also seems to be this threshold effect where donors that are already using country systems can tolerate a decline in public finance management systems, but there isn't as much of an uptake by donors of using public finance management systems when there is an improvement in these systems. And this seems to be dependent on other non-public finance management factors such as the political environment, the economic environment, and so on. So another issue that we find is that it's important to make this distinction between using country capacity to manage donor resources and to use country systems in managing donor resources. So, for instance, that would be creating a public project implementation unit staffed by country officials to manage donor resources, but that is parallel to the country system. So data from the latest Global Partnership Monitoring Report does show that there has been a slight decline in the commitments to using country systems, and this seems to be mostly in the countries that are most reliant on aid. So one of our suggestions is that donors take a trailblazer role in countries, and DFID, we see, has taken this role in several countries where they've been the first mover to use country systems and other donors have followed. Some of our work that's coming up in 2015 is we'll be doing a pilot case study in Senegal. This was initiated by the Affected Institutions Platform in connection with the Ministry of Finance, and Caribbean USA and EIP will be visiting Senegal to work with the technical finance partners and the Senegalese government. The reason why we decided to do this is because there has been a slight improvement in the public finance management systems in Senegal, but yet there's been a decline in the use of country systems. So donors that have been using country systems may not be using those anymore, even though there have been improvements. So this is just showing the decline in the use of country systems that we've seen between 2010 and 2013. And we hope that this pilot study will firstly strengthen the coordination between the Senegalese government and relevant technical finance partners, and better understand the disconnect between public finance management reforms and the use of country systems that I spoke about a bit earlier. And this is one of the issues that we do see, that there is a need for coordination between donors and governments. It's not one party that's responsible entirely for the reform. It's a working together between the two. So what should our goals be looking towards post-2015? And I'm going to echo some of the things that have already been said by other panel members here. Cadbury believes that there should be an increased use of country systems, so a move towards the Busan Agreement, irrespective of modality. So we heard yesterday Tanzania has made great efforts in increasing general budget support and having donors use country systems, but this doesn't have to be the modality that can be used. So even through project support, we feel that you should be using country systems. Aid should be channeled towards decreasing the dependency on aid rather than increasing it. And this should be done by broader development effectiveness of aid and initiatives to improve domestic resource mobilization. Aid should also go to improving country systems, capacity and governance and institutions within those countries, so that countries become less reliant on donor kind of capacity to help manage these systems and spending effectively on these areas. We know that previous gatherings to discuss the role of donor aid have focused mostly on how much aid is provided, but there needs to be even more shift towards how well it works. So quality versus quantity of aid provided, and the value for money in country and donor spending. So it's not just how well aid is spent, but it's how well governments spend their resources, and aid can play a role in improving that. And we need to reevaluate the incentives of donors and countries as part of this. So I'm just going to conclude with a quote from the Tunis Consensus on Development Effectiveness, that basically says that development in Africa should be driven by robust private sector-led growth and effective and accountable states able to finance their development needs from their own revenues. And this is one of the areas where aid can improve effectiveness. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joan. I think your statement that it's not just how well aid is effective, but how effective public and governmental systems are in transferring or in using their resources is really important. We've gone over time a bit, and so we aren't going to go through questions after this session, but to give just a little bit of compensation to the panelists to be able to make one last statement, I'm going to give them an opportunity to walk into an elevator with Ambassador Ntale or any of the other drafters of the outcome statement for ADIS, and in no more than 30 seconds, let us know what they would ask for in that outcome statement. So I think we're just going to go down the row. So Andrew, you're the first one in the elevator.
Hi, I'd have 2 points. I'd like to launch a group, a legitimate task force, to design a fit-for-purpose multilateral boost for social protection. I would use the words bolsa familia global because I'm rather fond of that, for those of you who know me. But that's what I would suggest. I would also suggest that we should have an aspiration on a global scale for a very large scale-up of official finance beyond ODA. And I would suggest even that could raise about $250 billion a year more without getting too hung up on the definitions.
Okay, basically, my first point would be really to, beyond finance, to really look at the strategy coordination, oversight, and support of projects. And when it comes also to the sectoral level, to look at sectors and even subsectors, because the averages can mask very important differences. And finally, the role of the development banks, especially the African Development Bank, would be crucial in terms of tools to implement the strategies.
3 things. Within the framework of a global fund for social protection, establish a weather-indexed agricultural insurance window to address the needs of especially rural folk, smallholder agriculturists that are falling off. 2, support national, sub-national level data generation and management, especially through review and restarting of civil registration. And 3, fund operational research and some pilots around the issue of integrated development, which needs long-term funding.
Thank you. Well, it's really about raising more money. If we don't have more money, we can't do anything else that we want. We won't allocate things better. We won't help countries. We won't help sectors. We won't sort out the quality problems. We won't deal with shocks or prevent a debt crisis by having more grants or having enough money to do catalytic financing. So please, can we raise more money through global public finance? And that means global taxes and SDR issuance, as well as getting people to commit strongly on ODA and South-South cooperation. We could raise 500 billion a year from doing that. If we can't do that, then the best thing we can do is change global tax rules and pay taxes in developing countries.
I feel a bit weird giving advice to myself. But I would say I would love it if the donors would be able to come up with some really hard targets on how much they will put towards tax administration and tax improvement in terms of ODA capacity for them and capacity building in developing countries. And then I would really love to see, you know, I'm fairly new to the UN, so I'm not going to say the UN has to be the one that leads all of the tax coordination in the world, but I'd love to see a truly inclusive and participatory tax policy making forum for governments to sort out some of the issues, the real issues we're seeing that are becoming much worse in tax avoidance and evasion.
I think I would just reiterate that external financing, whether it's from multilateral development banks or from donor aid, should be going towards reducing the dependency on external financing. And this is by improving accountability, governance, institutions, ultimately resilience of economies.
All right, thanks everyone for a really rich discussion. Just so you know, the presentations will be circulated and are posted online. Some of these papers are already out, and we'll be sharing those. Others are forthcoming, but you will have access to those. I also wanted to say, during the coffee break, it'd be great if you can take a look at kind of the graphic illustration that we have in the back of the room that is trying to capture what we've been discussing, as well as take a look at some of the data hotspots in the coffee break area to get a closer look at what is behind some of these discussions. And I'm going to turn it over to Gideon now.